The Air Force ordered 40,000 of its own revolvers destroyed, and the order does not say they failed in the air. It says target practice. It says commercial ammunition with lead bullets, crushed, cut, torched, and sold off by weight. About 50 of the Colt version are now catalogued as genuine. 8 months after the revised order went out, a Strategic Air Command training manual still listed the gun airmen were supposed to qualify with. The officer who shaped it never got his name on anything. The frame he asked for was sold commercially until 1986. Somewhere in that paperwork is a lieutenant colonel taking 0.08 of an inch off a revolver frame because it sat too thick against a flying man's hand. In 2024, at a shooting event, a retired Air Force pilot was handed one of the flattened ones. The backstrap marking was still perfectly readable. Late in 1959, in base armories across the Air Force, men who repaired weapons for a living spent their working days destroying them. The instruction was letter number 5965 out of Headquarters Air Material Command from a division called Redistribution and Marketing, dated the 21st of September and revised on the 23rd of October. Revolvers' access to Air Force requirements were to be mutilated to prevent further use as a weapon. Torches, saws, presses. The guns came off the bench, folded flat. What the order does not contain is any account of one of these revolvers failing in flight or on the ground or in anyone's hands during an emergency. The reasoning it gives is narrow and specific. The guns were unsafe for sustained firing as in target practice, and unsafe with standard commercial .38 cartridges loaded with lead bullets. That is the whole charge against them. 8 years earlier, on the 14th of November 1951, 150 of them had left Hartford under Air Force numbers, bound for the port of embarkation at San Francisco. Korea was in its second year. Nobody kept a list of who received them. An American serviceman in those years carried what the last war had left over. The M1911A1 pistol weighed 39 ounces empty, ran 8.5 inches end to end, and Army practice was to carry it hammer down on an empty chamber. For a rifleman with a carbine slung, that was an inconvenience. For an airman, it was the entire problem, because the pistol was usually the only weapon he had, and he might need it in the first minutes after coming down. Loading it took 2 hands and a hard pull against a heavy spring. The Air Force was 4 years old when the first of these revolvers shipped. It had separated from the Army on the 18th of September 1947 and had no way of purchasing its own small arms. Army Ordnance did the buying and would keep doing it until Springfield Armory closed in 1967. 1 office, 2 services, 2 different problems. Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska took the largest single delivery of the Colt guns in 1951, 255 of them. Offutt was Strategic Air Command. Crews sat ramp alert in flying clothing beside loaded aircraft for hours at a stretch, and the revolver on the vest was survival equipment, something for a man on the ground in bad weather, a long way from anyone friendly. Most of them never fired it outside a range. Each gun carried 2 numbers, one from the factory that built it, and one stamped on the butt by the Air Force, running in a single unbroken sequence that ignored the maker entirely. Air Force number 1 through Air Force number 2399, Colts and Smiths counted as one fleet. And in March 1951, before any of them existed, a lieutenant colonel named Frank S. Allen had told Smith & Wesson its frame was too thick to sit properly in a hand. The difference he wanted was 0.08 of an inch. The company went away and built a new frame to his number. If this sort of thing is worth your time, a like and a subscribe help. Stay with it, though. What ended these guns is worse than a scandal, because there is no villain in it, only a contract that said aluminium, and a factory that had already fixed the same fault on its civilian line. Why would 3 ounces on a revolver justify a design program at all? Because of the seat. By the early 50s, jet aircraft were flying too fast for a man to climb out of them, and the seats that threw him clear were driven first by propellant charges and then by rockets. Everything he wore went out with him under that acceleration. A pistol on a survival vest had weight and inertia and could tear loose. On the B-52, the navigator and radar navigator sat on the lower deck and ejected downward. The F-104 pilot ejected downward too because the tail was too tall to clear its speed. Anything that came adrift went past a man's head on the way out. Then there were the arms. Ejecting at speed threw them into the airstream and they broke. So the weapon had to be workable one-handed with either hand by somebody who had just been badly hurt. A pistol carried on an empty chamber failed that outright. The ounces were never vanity. In February 1953, with guns in the field on 4 continents, the Air Force wrote to the Chief of Ordnance about what use had shown. The Colt passed. The Smith did not. Ejector rods and side plate screws were working loose under firing. What Smith & Wesson arrived at was a 6th screw added to hold the 5th in place. Collectors still call it the bug screw. A screw whose only job is to stop another screw from walking out of a survival weapon. 2 springs before that letter, Allen had a table of revolvers laid out in front of him, and 2 men helping him shoot them. One was Alvin Barr, a magazine field editor. The other was Julian Hatcher, a retired major general who had run the small arms division of the Ordnance Department through the Second World War, and now wrote for the American Rifleman. The samples on the table ran from 10.5 ounces up to 25. One of them, a Smith & Wesson experimental gun, catalogued as X65, had been shipped to Allen on the 9th of March. What the 3 of them found was not about weight at all. The heaviest revolver on the table was the most punishing to fire, and one of the lightest was among the most comfortable, and the difference between them was the shape of a piece of walnut. Allen had reshaped some of the grips himself before handing the guns back, filling the web of the hand, carried up to the frame so the recoil had nowhere to bite. That shape went on to the production guns and stayed there for 30 years. He wrote about small pistols in the American Rifleman in March 1952, and his name is on that. It is on no revolver. In August 1953, the Ordnance Department standardized a .38 special cartridge called M41 ball, a 130-grain jacketed bullet, 16,000 pounds of pressure, 950 feet per second. That was the diet these revolvers were meant to live on. It is not what they were fed. Stocks of the wartime load, a heavier 158-grain bullet in a steel jacket at higher pressure, were still moving through the depots, and by later accounts the Air Force went on buying it alongside M41 after the Army had declared it obsolete. Units bought commercially as well, for range days, whatever the local supplier had on the shelf. And there were the survival rounds. Tracer, developed at the Navy's request in 1943 so a downed aviator could signal for rescue, issued an aircrew kit and fired through the same cylinders in training. A supply clerk hands out what is in front of him. He has a requisition and a pallet, not a contract specification. Smith & Wesson knew what was happening to the metal. In 1954, the company replaced the aluminum cylinders in the revolvers it sold to the public with steel ones. The civilian gun got steel. The Air Force gun did not. Deliveries of aluminum-cylindered revolvers to the Air Force continued for another 3 years until 1957 because that was what the contract called for, and altering it would have meant reopening a competition that Colt had already lost. So the order that flattened 40,000 revolvers in 1959 concerned a fault the manufacturer had quietly corrected on its own line 5 years earlier for paying customers. About 40,000 of them were delivered between 1953 and 1957 under 2 contracts. Roy Jenks, who kept the company's history, narrowed the figure to 39,545. In May 1956, a letter went from the Office of the Chief of Ordnance to Air Material Command about markings. The backstrap had read Property of U.S. Air Force. From that point, it read U.S. 3 years before the crushing began, the service's name came off its own guns by memorandum. The men who could have explained any of this were scattered, and the objects were scrap, so the reconstruction had to come from outside the service, and it began with a company historian. Jenks published on the Model 13 in the Arms Gazette in May 1975, 22 years after the contract and 16 after the destruction order, working from factory records because the factory had kept them. Richard Nahas and Kevin Williams of the Smith & Wesson Collectors Association went further into shipping ledgers and contract numbers. Nahas holds a Colt factory letter that puts those 150 guns on the road to San Francisco on that November day in 1951. The surviving archive of an Air Force program is corporate. The service destroyed the evidence. Hartford and Springfield filed it. Aluminum revolver frames were 4 years old when these guns entered service, and nobody had a decade of data on what a light alloy does after a few thousand firings. The cylinders genuinely were cracking. A cracked cylinder inside a survival vest is a live hazard to the man wearing it, not a theoretical one, and the Air Force was carrying nuclear weapons over the Arctic with those men strapped in beside them. The phrase about guns' excess to requirements was written to stop units disarming themselves before replacements arrived. Smith & Wesson could not have fitted steel cylinders on its own initiative without breaching a contract won in open competition. Colt would have protested and would have been entitled to. The contract said aluminum, and it was executed to the letter. The explanation that attached itself to all of this, and has been repeated in catalogs, reference works, and auction listings for decades, is that the Air Force built a deliberately weakened cartridge for these revolvers and strengthened it again once they were gone. Checked against the standards, that is not what happened. M41 was approved in August 1953 before it was ever paired with the gun at one pressure, and the technical orders and field manuals since show no change to it. The low figure that circulates appears to have belonged to a separate 38 short Colt training load and drifted onto the wrong cartridge. Mike Wood, a retired Air Force pilot, traced it with the ammunition historian Mark Frick and found no document supporting it anywhere. The neatest part of the story, a special feeble round, a gun too fragile for ordinary ammunition, was assembled afterwards by people who were not there. Williams recorded one other thing, which bears on nothing. Partway through the Air Force numbering, the abbreviation stamped on the butt changed. 3-digit guns read number, 4-digit guns read NO. At the same point, the direction of the stamping reversed. Somebody at a bench made that decision, and it is still catalogued 70 years later. Picture that bench in the winter of 1959. A press, a torch, a crate of revolvers with Air Force numbers on the butts, and one man working through them. There is no roster of who did it. No oral history program went looking for them. No names were taken. What survives from those men is physical, a number of crushed frames that never reached the scrap bin, which collectors have long assumed were pocketed by the people ordered to destroy them. That is an assumption. It is not a document. The narrow frame Allen asked for outlived everyone involved. Smith & Wesson sold it commercially as the Model 12 until 1986, 33 years, and the aluminum-framed revolver stopped being an experiment and became an ordinary thing to own. The Air Force went back to steel .38s and kept its aircrew and revolvers for decades afterwards. The Army's 1947 requirement, a double-action 9mm under 25 ounces, sat unfilled from the summer of 1955 when a logistics decision at the top of the Army judged the existing stock of wartime .45s sufficient and suspended the trials until the mid-1980s, 30 years, and the specification had barely moved. Of the Colt guns, roughly 50 are now catalogued as authentic. One is in the museum at Springfield Armory, intact, in a case, in the condition almost none of them ended in, and the order that killed them had a gap in it. Guns excess to requirements were to be destroyed. Guns still needed were not. In June 1960, 8 months after the revised letter went out, Strategic Air Command issued its Small Arms Training Program, Manual 50-2, and the M13 was still listed among the weapons airmen would qualify with. The clause written to destroy them is the reason any survived. In 2024, at a shooting event, a man named Matt Olivier handed one to Mike Wood, the retired pilot who would spend the next year working out where these guns had come from. It was one of the demilled ones, crushed, folded, finished. He photographed the top strap and the back strap, and both were still perfectly legible. They cut out the cylinder, flattened the frame, and sold the rest by the pound, and the only thing on it they could not remove was the line saying whose it was. If you got something out of this, a like and a subscribe help. And if you or your family served with Strategic Air Command, flying out of Offutt on a bomber or a tanker crew, or standing at a base armory bench in 1959 with that letter in front of you, I'd like to read about it in the comments.